Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the production of oil. Now, Russia is a member of the biggest oil consortium in the world, OPEC Plus. And OPEC Plus meets on a regular basis to talk about how much oil each of the countries is allowed to produce under their quotas in order to maintain the oil price at the desired level. And interestingly, over the past few months, OPEC Plus have been increasing the amount of production. And the reason that they're doing that isn't because there's an increase in demand. If you've been following what's been going on geopolitically, you'll know that there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, particularly caused by Donald Trump's tariffs, which have affected global trade and will potentially cause the global economy to slow down for the rest of 2025 if they remain at the levels that were previously discussed. So, as it stands at the moment, you would have expected OPEC Plus to be cutting back on oil production in order to keep prices high, because generally speaking, the OPEC Plus countries want to see oil prices maintained at a high level so that they can earn lots of profit on all of the oil that they're selling. However, Saudi Arabia, which is one of the senior partners in the OPEC Plus arrangement, has been looking to increase production because it wants to punish some of the countries that have actually been overproducing. They've secretly been producing too much oil, more than they were allowed to under their quotas. And as a result of this, OPEC Plus has been basically producing more oil than it should have. And so Saudi Arabia now wants to pull those countries back into line. Now, in terms of OPEC and OPEC Plus, this is the list of the original OPEC members. You can see here that we've got 12 nations, and OPEC was originally formed in 1960 by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Libya joined in 1962, the UAE 1967, Algeria 1969, Nigeria 1971, and then the Republic of Congo joined in 2018, Equatorial Guinea in 2017, and Gabon, originally joined in 1975, left in 1995, but rejoined in 2016. Now, in 2016, OPEC Plus was actually created, which was an additional 10 member countries. And as you can see, the biggest of these was Russia. And they were joined by Kazakhstan, Mexico, Oman, Azerbaijan, Sudan, South Sudan, Malaysia, Bahrain, and Brunei. And so these countries now make up OPEC Plus, and they meet on a regular basis. Now, as I mentioned, it was recently reported that some of the countries had been overproducing against what their permitted quotas were. Now, no details were provided of the actual amount of overproduction, but this list shows the countries that have been reported to have been overproducing, and that includes Iraq, Kazakhstan, Russia, interestingly. So, as one of the senior members, you wouldn't have expected Russia to actually be breaching the rules, but apparently they have been. United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Oman. And if we have a look at the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that there is some compensation that has now been agreed between April 25 and June 26. And the way this compensation works is basically these countries have now agreed to reduce the amount of their production below their agreed quota. So basically, if they've been overproducing over the past couple of years, they're now being cut back. They're being told you can't actually produce as much as you were originally meant to because we need to balance it up. And if we look at the numbers here, you can see that Iraq have been told to cut back by up to 140,000 barrels per day. So that would sort of indicate to me that they may have been overproducing by 140,000 barrels per day to offset that. Kazakhstan, 116,000. Russia, 85,000 barrels per day. The UAE, 132,000. Kuwait, 23,000. And Oman, 15,000. So these countries are going to have to cut back on their quotas. However, overall, OPEC Plus is increasing the amount. And I thought it was worth having a look at this summary of what's been going on for the last couple of years, really to put into perspective why OPEC Plus is increasing at the moment. And you can see that back in April 23, OPEC Plus voluntarily agreed to cut back their general production by 1.66 million barrels per day. And the reason why they did that was because at that time, oil prices had started to fall. And so they wanted to keep oil prices high. So they cut back on production to reduce the supply of oil, which should have pushed prices up. It didn't really work because the general slowdown in the global economy was more rapid than the production cuts coming from OPEC Plus. So in June 23, they decided to cut back by a further 3.66 million barrels per day. So overall, between those two cuts, that's over 5 million barrels of oil per day that was cut from the global supply. And that didn't work either. So in November 23, there was an additional 2.2 million barrels cut back. So obviously, OPEC Plus has already cut back quite severely in 2023. And what's happening now is that Saudi Arabia wants to get back to the original production levels. So they've announced that in April, they were increasing the total supply by 411,000 barrels per day. And they've now confirmed that that was happening in May, June, and at the most recent meeting, it will also be happening in July. So across the last 4 months, we have seen over 1.6 million barrels of oil production being put back into the global supply. And in terms of the breakdown of who's actually increasing their supplies, this shows the 8 countries that agreed to do that. And you can see that Saudi Arabia is increasing its supply by around about 167,000 barrels per day. Russia, 79,000, the UAE, 77,000, Iraq, 37, Kuwait 23, Kazakhstan 14, Algeria 9, and Oman 7,000. And that totals around 411,000 barrels per day. Now, interestingly, at the most recent meeting, it was reported that Saudi Arabia and Russia were not quite on the same page. Saudi Arabia is very keen to increase these production levels, but Russia not as keen. And the reason why Russia doesn't want to do it is because it doesn't want to see the price of oil falling, because oil revenue is absolutely critical to the Russian economy. And so if the price of oil falls, it means that total revenues are likely to go down for Russia. Now, if we have a look at Russia's export levels, you can see that over the past 4 years, there's actually been a reduction in the total amount that Russia is exporting. Back in 2021, it was exporting just under 8 million barrels per day. It increased to 8 million in 2022. We then saw a reduction in 2023 and a further reduction in 2024. And it's estimated at the moment that Russia is exporting somewhere between 7 and 7.5 million barrels per day. Now, interestingly, if we look at the split of who's buying that, as if you follow the channel, you'll be fully aware of this. Back in 2021 and 2022, the biggest single buyer was the European Union, which was buying lots of oil directly through pipelines that Russia had set up and supplying very cheap oil. As a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the European Union basically decided it no longer wanted to continue with the majority of those purchases. And you can see that the blue section has reduced significantly in 2023 and 2024. It hasn't been extinguished because certain landlocked countries in Europe are still struggling to be able to find cost-efficient ways to replace that Russian oil. But you can see that the two biggest sections in 23 and 24 are China, which is shown by the large dark green section, and India, which is shown by the yellow section. And between those two countries, they account for more than half of all of Russia's exports. But we've got a declining trend here in terms of the total volume. And one of the other problems that Russia has faced is that it's at offer discounts to the general market price for oil because of the sanctions that are in place. Because if you're India or China, you want to make sure that you're getting a good deal because you're running the risk of potentially having to face some secondary sanctions or some other issues if you step out of line and accidentally take a payment from a company that's been sanctioned or something along those lines. Now, if we have a look at this chart, it shows the movement in the price of Russian oil, which is referred to as Urals crude. That's the main blend that Russia is selling over the past 5 years. You can see that in 2022, immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the price actually spiked and was close to $100 per barrel. And the reason for that was because of the uncertainty at that time. Nobody really knew what was going to happen with global oil supplies because Russia was one of the world's biggest exporters. It's one of the world's biggest producers. The USA is the single biggest producer, but it isn't the biggest exporter because the USA consumes a lot of its own oil. Russia doesn't consume the majority of its own oil, it's exporting the vast majority. It's producing somewhere in the region of 10 million barrels per day, and it's exporting 7 to 7.5. So 3/4 of the oil that Russia is producing is being exported. So the price spiked at $100, but as you can see, by the end of 2022, it had reduced significantly. It was actually down to around $55 per barrel. And the reason for that was because of the huge amount of sanctions that were put into place. The West was trying to make it very difficult for Russia to actually be able to sell its oil to anybody. And so the discounts being offered were massive. They were $20 or $30 per barrel compared with the general market price for Brent crude oil. Now, over the last couple of years, Russia has found a variety of different ways to export its oil, and also because India stepped in 2023 and started buying, it filled up that gap. And so the discount on Russian oil reduced. It's now sitting at around about $10 per barrel versus $30 in 2022. And you can see that between 23 and the middle of 2024, the price of Russian oil actually increased and rose above $80 per barrel. And that's good news if you're exporting 7 million barrels, because an increase of $30 is going to represent a huge increase in revenue. But as you can see, over the last 12 months, there's been a significant decline in the price of Urals oil. And most recently, it's now below $60 per barrel. And that's important because the price caps that were set by the West, trying to limit the amount of revenue that Russia was earning from its oil sales, have been set at $60 per barrel. So Russia is now legitimately selling its oil below that price cap. So in theory, it could sell as much oil as it wants because the price cap is now redundant at the current prices. But actually, that doesn't represent good news for Russia because it wants to sell its oil for $80 or $100 per barrel because it will get more revenue. So as the price comes down, this is representing a serious risk to the Russian economy because, as we've discussed before, oil income represents somewhere between 30 and 40% of total revenue for Russia. So when you've got a huge fall in that revenue, Russia isn't able to offset it with revenue from anywhere else. It just means that it will have less money. And when it has less money, it therefore has to dip into the National Wealth Fund, sell its gold reserves, things like that, to keep the war in Ukraine going. And I thought it was worth having a look at this table, which gives you an indication of what a drop in the price of Russian oil means for the Russian economy. So if we start on, and this assumes that this 7 million barrels per day is maintained, that is the export amount for Russia. So you can see at the top here that a $1 drop in price would obviously mean a $7 million loss of revenue per day, because if you're exporting 7 million barrels and you lose $1, it's $7 million. Now, over the course of a month, a 30-day month, that would be $210 million. And over a 365-day year, that would be over $2.5 billion. But that's only $1. And if we have a look at what $10 would mean, it would be $70 million per day, $2.1 billion per month, and over $25 billion per year. But if we jump back to the chart, you can see that over the last 12 months, the price of Russian oil has fallen from around $80 to the current level of less than $60. So that's a drop of around, more than $20. So if we have a look at $20, you can see a $20 fall represents a loss of $140 million per day, $4.2 billion per month, and over $50 billion per year. And if the price was to fall by $40, which, if we go back to that chart, it actually has, since 2022, when the price was sitting at around $100, we've seen a $40 fall. That represents a fall in income for Russia of $280 million per day, $8.4 billion per month, and over $102 billion per year. So you can start to understand, when you look at these figures, why Russia isn't very keen on OPEC Plus continuing to increase its production at a time when global demand is still volatile. We're still seeing lots of movements in the markets on a daily basis because nobody really knows what 2025 is going to look like. Because until we've got a firm position on Donald Trump's global tariffs, we don't know how much countries are going to be exporting to the USA. We don't know what the USA economy, which is the biggest in the world, is going to do in 2025. Because if we see huge price increases as a result of the tariffs and we see rising inflation, we could then see rising interest rates. That would reduce business demand for loans, potentially reduces investment, and could cause the US economy to slow down, which would mean that the global economy would slow down. Because if your number one market reduces in terms of its growth, then that's going to impact on everybody. And of course, the other biggest economy is China, and they're at the second most affected economy at the moment, but from the tariffs, because the biggest market that they're exporting to is the USA. So we've got a lot of uncertainty at the moment in terms of what the level of global demand for oil is going to be. So you would imagine that OPEC Plus should really be sitting on their hands thinking, well, let's just wait and see how things pan out before we commit to increasing the production levels. However, Saudi Arabia doesn't really care about that. All they want to do is make sure that the companies and the countries that have been overproducing are punished. So they're increasing the amount of oil that's going into the global market at a time of uncertain demand, and that's likely to push down the price and therefore will reduce the amount of revenue that Russia is earning. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with OPEC Plus at the moment is really quite interesting, because when you look at the history of OPEC Plus, and this is a consortium that's been around since the 1960s, so we've got a lot of data to show what they've been doing. Over the last 60 years or so, they've basically been making decisions to keep the price of oil high. So at times when demand is falling, they've generally cut back on production to make sure that supply and demand stay high, they equilibrize at a high level, and so they don't lose out. Because when the price of oil crashes, all of these countries suffer. So even though they could sell more oil, it's actually not worth it. You don't need to pull it out of the ground. There is a break-even point for a lot of these countries, and they want to make sure that their profit margins stay high. So historically, OPEC Plus have kept a very keen eye on what's happening in the global economy, and at times like now, when we've got a lot of uncertainty, you would have expected OPEC Plus to be holding back on production, maybe even cutting back on production, reducing it to try to keep oil prices high. However, what we are seeing is the opposite of that. That happened in 2023. OPEC Plus announced these large cuts, and it didn't really work because global demand was falling at such a rate that even though they cut back on the supply, the price of oil continued to go down. And what we're seeing now is that Saudi Arabia has decided that this is the opportune time to start increasing production again. As I mentioned in this video, Saudi Arabia believes that a lot of the other countries have been overproducing. They've been trying to secretly make more profit against the wishes of OPEC Plus. And Saudi Arabia wants to put that position right. So they've come out and said, we're going to increase the supply. And they've done that in April, May, June, and they will do it in July as well. And who knows, they may continue doing this throughout the rest of 2025. Now, some of the countries who've been accused of overproducing have actually been told that they can't keep producing at the same levels. They've actually got to hold back on their production levels to let the other members benefit from increases in their production. So we're seeing a sort of a reset in terms of how OPEC Plus is working. But the bottom line for oil prices is going to be bad news, because if you've got uncertain demand, if you've got potentially reducing demand, the last thing that you want if you're an oil seller is to increase the supply, because simple economics tells us that if you increase the supply at the same time that demand is falling, then prices are likely to fall rapidly. And that's what everybody is now expecting for the rest of 2025. Now, countries like Saudi Arabia can probably take a view on that. They don't really care because they're making so much money that it doesn't really matter. But from Russia's point of view, it's absolutely critical. to gather the most amount of revenue that you can from the sale of your oil. And the biggest single income earner for Russia is oil exports. It represents around 35 to 40% of total Russian revenue. So the last thing that Russia wants at the moment is to see oil prices falling because we've got demand going down. So realistically, there could be a drop in the volume of oil that Russia is selling. It might drop below 7 million barrels per day, could get down to 6 million barrels or 5. There's been some reports that in recent months, some of these exports have been down to less than 4 million barrels per day for Russia because China is now reconsidering whether it wants to keep buying as much oil from Russia because there are now threats of secondary sanctions, and the USA is talking about a potential 500% tariff on any country that's found to be buying oil from Russia if Russia doesn't agree to some sort of peace deal in Ukraine. So there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment in terms of what China is going to do. That's causing problems for Russia. But the biggest problem is the fall in the price of oil because that is having a direct negative impact on the amount of income that Russia is earning and therefore is hurting the Russian economy. So it is really painful for Russia to vote in favor of these OPEC plus cutbacks, as it had done recently. And as it was reported, Saudi Arabia and Russia have been coming at loggerheads that they don't have the same agenda here. Russia wants to keep the price high. Saudi Arabia wants to increase production. You can't do both things. It's impossible. And so Russia has basically agreed to this increase in production. But it will be interesting to see whether they continue to increase production, whether Russia continues to sign off on this, or there comes a point where Russia says, actually, we're not doing it anymore, or maybe even they decide that they can no longer be a member of OPEC Plus because they need to look after their own interests. But the overall summary of today's video is that what we've seen out of OPEC Plus is another increase in production, another 411,000 barrel per day increase. This is the fourth consecutive month that this has happened. That's driving down the price of oil globally, and that is seriously bad news for Russia because Russia is totally dependent on oil exports and oil revenue to keep feeding the economy. And as the price of oil goes down, it reduces the amount of revenue that Russia is earning and therefore is hurting Russia. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And if you're a long-term supporter through either Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, that keeps me motivated. It really keeps me focused on trying to make as many videos as possible. So thank you so much for that support. And here's something to put a smile on your face.